Margaret Greene arrived at St. Aldine Regional Medical Center before the birds were awake. It was 5:40 in the morning. The parking lot was mostly empty, and a cold wind pushed dry leaves across the concrete. She carried her tote bag over one shoulder, her thermos in the other hand, and she walked through the side entrance the way she always did, quietly, without fuss, like someone who understood that hospitals belong first to the people inside them, not the staff. She had done this for 19 years. Most people did not notice Maggie. That was not unusual for nurses, especially the good ones. She did not wear bright colors or speak in a loud voice. She did not call attention to herself during staff meetings or send long emails. She simply showed up, did her work with full concentration, and then went home. What set her apart from other nurses was not something that appeared in her file. It was something you could only see if you watched her for a while. She remembered things. Not just medical things, though she remembered those too, down to the smallest detail. She remembered that the man in room 114 was afraid of the dark and needed the hallway light left on. She remembered that the woman in room 107 liked ice in her water, but never asked for it directly. She remembered which patients had family nearby, and which ones had nobody. For the ones who had nobody, Maggie made sure she stopped a little longer. The veterans trusted her most of all. Over the years, a number of former soldiers had come through the hospital's doors. Some came for surgery, some for treatment of long-term illness, and some came carrying the kind of invisible weight that doctors could not easily diagnose. These men and women had seen and done things that left marks on them that could not be photographed or measured. Maggie never tried to fix that. She never offered cheerful speeches or forced optimism. She simply sat with them. She listened. She asked simple questions and did not push for answers. And somehow, that was enough. Soldiers who refused to eat started eating. Patients who refused to sleep began to rest. Men who had not spoken in days found themselves talking. Nobody at the hospital wrote this down in a report. It was not the kind of thing that showed up in numbers. Richard Holloway had arrived at St. Aldine 6 months earlier. He was not a doctor. He had come from the world of business consulting, where he had spent his career studying systems, improving efficiency, and cutting costs. The hospital board had hired him with a clear goal: modernize the institution and reduce spending. Holloway was good at his job in the way that a calculator is good at math. He was precise, organized, and completely comfortable making decisions based on data. What he was not comfortable with, what he had not been trained to see, was the kind of value that cannot be entered into a spreadsheet. He conducted his first quarterly review in the conference room on the 4th floor. He wore a pressed shirt and had a tablet in front of him with multiple open documents. He moved through departments systematically. When he arrived at the staffing section, his eyes stopped on a line near the bottom. A senior nurse in the general medicine ward. 19 years of service. Salary at the top of the pay scale. No management role, no special title. To Richard Holloway, the numbers told a simple story. High cost, unclear return. He flagged the line with his stylus and moved on. Maggie did not know what was coming when she finished her pre-dawn rounds on a Tuesday morning. She had checked on 6 patients, updated 2 charts, and refilled the water pitcher of an elderly man who always woke up thirsty before the breakfast cart arrived. She was walking back toward the nursing station when a woman from Human Resources appeared at the end of the hallway. "Margaret, could you come with me for a moment?" The conference room was cold. There was a letter on the table. The HR manager, a young woman named Claire who clearly did not want to be there, slid the letter across and explained that the hospital was restructuring and that Maggie's position had been eliminated. Maggie read the letter once. She looked at Claire, who looked at the table. Maggie asked a few quiet questions about the notice period and her benefits. Then she folded the letter, put it in her tote bag, went to her locker, and handed in her badge. She was gone before the day shift arrived. She drove home slowly. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at her garden, where the first green things of spring were just beginning to push through the soil. She did not cry immediately. She felt something closer to disbelief, the mild, floating shock of a person who has given a large part of their life to something and has just been told, politely, that it was not needed anymore. She did not call anyone, but someone else was already making calls. Calvin Dempsey, Cal, to everyone who knew him, had served 2 tours overseas before a roadside explosion ended his military career and began a very different kind of fight. He had come to St. Aldine 18 months ago after a rough stretch, and he had not wanted to be there. He had been difficult with the doctors. He had refused meals. He had sat in his room with the blinds shut and spoken to almost nobody. Then Maggie had knocked on his door. She had not come in with a clipboard or a treatment plan. She had simply asked him if she could sit down. He had shrugged. She had sat. She had asked him, after a long silence, whether he preferred music or quiet when he was trying to sleep. He had said quiet. She had noted it down and made sure the hallway outside his room was kept as silent as possible on night rounds. The next week, she had asked him about his dog, whose photo was taped to the wall above his bed. He had talked for 20 minutes. By the time Cal left the hospital, he was eating regularly, sleeping better, and had agreed to begin an outpatient program. He called it the best medical experience of his life, and he attributed almost all of it to a nurse who had never once told him to cheer up. When a friend in the veterans community texted him that Maggie had been let go, Cal went still for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called someone. That person called someone else. Within 36 hours, a quiet conversation had traveled through a network of men and women spread across 4 states. A network held together not by any organization, but by shared experience and something that looks very much like loyalty. On the 3rd morning after Maggie's dismissal, Richard Holloway pulled into the hospital parking lot and noticed a group of men standing near the main entrance. They were not blocking the door. They were not shouting. They were simply standing, still and upright, in the way that people who have spent years in uniform tend to stand even when they are no longer in it. Several of them wore their medals on their jackets. There were 12 of them. Holloway walked past them with a brief nod and went to his office. 20 minutes later, his assistant informed him that the men were asking to speak with him. Not with HR, not with patient relations, with him. He went down to the lobby. Cal Dempsey spoke first. He was calm and unhurried, and he began not with complaints, but with a story. He told Holloway about his first week at the hospital, about shutting the blinds, about refusing food, about the slow and unlikely shift that had begun with a nurse asking a simple question and actually waiting for the answer. He was not dramatic about it. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are reporting facts they know to be true. Then the man next to him spoke. He talked about the night his surgery had gone longer than expected, and he had woken up at 2 a.m. frightened and disoriented. He said that Maggie had been there when he opened his eyes. He did not know if she had been there the whole time, or if she had noticed something on the monitor and come in. All he knew was that she was there, and she had spoken to him quietly until he was calm enough to sleep again. A 3rd man spoke, then a 4th. One of them described a moment when Maggie had caught an error in a medication instruction, a small discrepancy that could have had serious consequences. She had flagged it without drama, corrected it through the right channels, and never mentioned it to the patient. The man had only found out later, from another nurse who had been there. Another man talked about a fellow veteran, a friend of his who had tried to check himself out of the hospital against doctors' advice. He had been certain he was fine. He had been wrong. Maggie had not argued with him or threatened him with paperwork. She had asked him one question. Would he give her just one more day before he decided? He had stayed. 6 days later, the doctors caught something that, untreated, could have ended his life. That man was not in the lobby. He was at home with his family. He was alive. Holloway stood and listened. He had expected to manage a situation. He had not expected this. Dr. Sandra Obi arrived in the lobby while the 4th man was still speaking. She had heard the gathering from upstairs and come down, and when she understood what was happening, she stepped forward and added her own account. She spoke about watching Maggie work over many years, about the things a doctor notices from a distance and is grateful for. She spoke carefully and without emotion, but the people listening heard what was underneath the careful words. A nursing aide standing near the elevator began to cry quietly. A porter who had been pretending to check something nearby stopped pretending and just stood there. Upstairs, the hospital board had been notified. 3 members gathered in a conference room and pulled up the lobby's security feed on a laptop. They watched 12 men with medals speak one at a time to a man in a pressed shirt. They watched the man in the pressed shirt stand very still. The meeting of the board that afternoon was brief. By 4 o'clock, Maggie's phone rang. It was a board representative she had never spoken to, calling to tell her that her termination had been reversed. He said that the board had reviewed the circumstances and that an error in judgment had been made. He said this clearly and without hedging. He also told her that there was a new role being created, patient continuity coordinator, and that the hospital would like her to consider it. The role was built around what she already did. Maggie sat at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand after the call ended. She looked out at the garden. The light was different at this hour, softer and more golden, and the early spring green seemed brighter than it had that morning. She thought about the 12 men who had stood in that lobby for her. She thought about Cal, who had gone from a dark room with closed blinds to a person who used the word best to describe his time in a hospital. She thought about the man who had almost walked out and chosen to stay. She asked only one thing when she returned to work the next week. She asked that her overnight rounds not be changed. They were not changed. The hospital moved forward. Holloway remained as CEO, but the board put in place a new review process for staffing decisions that affected clinical care. It was a small structural change, quietly written into policy, unlikely to make the news. But in a hallway on the 3rd floor of St. Aldine Regional Medical Center, a night aide making her rounds would occasionally see the light on under a patient's door, and she would know, without having to ask, that Maggie was already in there. Sitting, listening, staying.